Tonight, we travel back in time to uncover the story of how medieval soldiers survived freezing nights in their tents, enduring winters that tested every fibre of their being. Before we begin, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the weight of winter darkness settling over a medieval military encampment. Picture thousands of canvas tents spread across a frozen landscape, their peaks dusted with snow that gleams silver under a cold moon. Inside these fragile shelters, men huddle together, their breath rising in visible clouds, their bodies wrapped in layers of wool that smell of smoke and sweat and the road. The wind tears at the tent fabric with fingers of ice, seeking every gap, every weakness in the shelter that stands between these soldiers and the killing cold of a medieval winter night. This is not a story of kings and castles, of grand battles immortalized in tapestries and songs. This is a story of ordinary men, pressed into service or bound by oath, who found themselves far from home as winter closed its grip around them. These were farmers and craftsmen, younger sons of minor nobility, professional soldiers who had learned their trade through years of campaigning. They came from every corner of medieval Europe, speaking different languages, worshipping in different ways, but united by a common struggle against an enemy that cared nothing for banners or battle lines. Winter was a merciless adversary, one that killed without passion, without prejudice, claiming the unprepared and the unlucky with equal efficiency. The medieval period stretched across 1,000 years, from roughly the 5th century to the 15th, and throughout this vast sweep of time, the fundamental challenges of winter warfare remained remarkably consistent. Whether you were a Norman soldier camped outside the walls of a Saxon fortress in the 11th century, or a French archer shivering in the mud of Agincourt in 1415, the problems you faced were essentially the same. How do you stay warm when temperatures plunge below freezing? How do you keep your body fueled when supply lines are disrupted by snow and ice? How do you maintain the will to fight when every morning brings fresh evidence of winter's toll? Men who didn't wake from their sleep, fingers and toes blackened by frostbite, the coughs and fevers that presage pneumonia and death. These questions demanded answers, and over centuries medieval armies developed a body of practical knowledge about cold weather survival. Some of this wisdom was written down in military treatises and campaign journals, but much of it existed as oral tradition, passed from veteran to recruit, refined through bitter experience. The solutions were not perfect. Men still died from exposure, from disease, from the 1,000 complications that arose when human bodies were pushed to their limits. But the soldiers who survived learned techniques that allowed them to endure conditions that would seem impossible to modern observers accustomed to central heating and insulated clothing. Understanding the context of medieval military life helps us appreciate the challenges soldiers faced. Medieval armies were not the professional, uniformly equipped forces we think of today. Instead, they were collections of men drawn from different social classes, each bringing their own equipment and expectations. A knight might campaign with several attendants, travelling in relative comfort with multiple changes of clothing, adequate food supplies, and quality equipment. Meanwhile, a peasant conscript might have nothing more than the clothes on his back, a simple weapon, and whatever food he could carry or forage along the way. This disparity in resources meant that winter affected different soldiers in profoundly different ways. The concept of a winter campaign itself requires some explanation. Throughout much of the medieval period, warfare followed seasonal patterns. Spring and summer were the traditional campaigning seasons, When roads were passable, forage was available for horses, and armies could move relatively freely across the landscape. Autumn brought the harvest, and armies often paused to allow soldiers to return home and gather crops. Winter was traditionally a time of rest, when armies dispersed to winter quarters or ceased operations entirely. However, this pattern was never absolute. Ambitious commanders might press campaigns into winter, seeking advantage while their enemies expected rest. Siege warfare in particular often continued through winter, as armies invested cities and castles regardless of season, settling in for months of patient starvation tactics. When armies did campaign through winter, or when circumstances forced them to maintain siege lines through the cold months, the challenges multiplied exponentially. Everything that was merely difficult in summer became potentially lethal in winter. A river crossing that was an inconvenience in July could be impossible in January, with bridges washed out by winter storms and fords frozen solid. A day's march that soldiers could complete easily in warm weather became an ordeal when snow lay deep on the roads and icy winds tore at exposed skin. The logistics of keeping an army fed and supplied, always challenging, became nightmarish when wagon wheels froze to the ground and pack animals died from cold and inadequate forage. The tent itself was the first line of defense against the elements, and medieval military tents came in a remarkable variety of designs, each adapted to specific needs and circumstances. For common soldiers, the most basic shelter was often the simple wedge or A-frame tent, a design that appeared in illuminated manuscripts and military manuals throughout the medieval period. These tents were typically made from heavy canvas or linen, woven tightly enough to shed rain and block wind, yet porous enough to allow some air circulation, preventing the dangerous build-up of moisture and carbon monoxide from fires or braziers. The fabric was usually left in its natural colour, a creamy white or beige that aged to brown and grey with use, though some units dyed their tents in identifying colours, creating a patchwork landscape when armies from multiple regions camped together. The wedge tent in its simplest form consisted of a rectangular piece of canvas draped over a horizontal ridgepole supported by two vertical posts at either end. The sides were pulled taut and staked to the ground, creating a triangular cross-section that shed snow and rain efficiently. A more sophisticated version added triangular end pieces that could be laced closed or opened for ventilation and access. The interior space was cramped by modern standards, typically measuring about 6 to 8 feet in length, 4 to 5 feet in width, and tall enough at the peak for a man to sit upright but not stand. This modest volume would shelter anywhere from 2 to 6 soldiers, depending on how tightly they were willing to pack themselves together. The materials used in tent construction deserve closer examination. Canvas, woven from hemp or cotton fibres, was the most common fabric for military tents throughout much of the medieval period. The weaving process created a relatively waterproof material, with the fibres swelling when wet to close small gaps in the weave. However, truly waterproof canvas required treatment with various substances. Some armies used linseed oil, carefully rubbed into the fabric to fill the spaces between threads. Others employed mixtures of beeswax and animal fats, creating a waxy coating that shed water effectively. These treatments had to be reapplied regularly, as use and exposure gradually wore away the protective layer. Linen, made from flax fibres, was another common tent material, particularly in regions where flax was widely cultivated. Linen tents were lighter than canvas, making them easier to transport, but they required more careful maintenance to remain weatherproof. The advantage of linen was its breathability, which helped manage condensation inside the tent, a constant problem in cold weather when warm, moist air from breathing and body heat would condense on cold tent walls, creating interior dampness that chilled soldiers and promoted mold growth. Historical sources and archaeological evidence suggest that these simple tents were surprisingly effective when properly maintained and used. The close quarters, while uncomfortable, actually aided in heat retention, as multiple bodies generated warmth that was trapped by the tent fabric and the soldiers' combined bedding. The low profile offered less surface area for wind to attack, and the steep sides shed accumulated snow before its weight could collapse the structure. However, these advantages came with significant drawbacks. The lack of headroom made any activity other than lying down or sitting difficult, and the tight confines meant that wet clothing and equipment had nowhere to dry properly, creating a perpetual dampness that chilled the men and rotted fabric and leather with remarkable speed. For soldiers of higher rank, pavilion tents offered considerably more comfort and space. These were typically circular or polygonal structures supported by a central pole, with the canvas walls angling outward from a point at the top, creating a cone or pyramid shape. The larger examples might be 12 to 15 feet in diameter, providing enough room for a bed, a small table and chair, storage chests, and even a brazier or small stove for heating. The walls were often divided into sections that could be rolled up in good weather or laced shut against wind and precipitation. Some pavilions featured an inner lining, creating a double wall construction that significantly improved insulation by trapping a layer of dead air between the two fabric surfaces. The construction of a pavilion tent was considerably more complex than a simple wedge tent. The central pole, typically made of wood and standing 8 to 12 feet tall, had to be strong enough to support the entire weight of the tent fabric, while also withstanding wind pressure. The fabric itself was cut into panels that were sewn together to create the conical or pyramidal shape, with careful attention to seam construction, as poorly sewn seams would leak and eventually tear under stress. Guy ropes, running from points around the tent's perimeter to stakes driven into the ground, provided stability and adjusted tension to keep the fabric taut. The double wall construction found in some higher quality pavilions represented sophisticated understanding of insulation principles. The outer wall bore the brunt of wind and precipitation, while the inner wall, suspended 6 inches to a foot inside the outer wall, created an air gap that dramatically reduced heat transfer. This dead air space worked on the same principle as modern double-glazed windows, with the still air acting as an insulator between the cold exterior and the warmer interior. The inner wall also caught condensation before it could drip onto occupants and equipment, channeling moisture to the tent's edges where it could be absorbed by bedding materials or allowed to run off. Round tents, sometimes called bell tents due to their shape, represented another design variation. These featured a circular floor plan and walls that curved smoothly from a peak at the center to stakes at the perimeter. The round design had structural advantages, distributing stress evenly around the perimeter rather than concentrating it at corners as in square or rectangular designs. This made round tents more stable in high winds and better able to shed snow accumulation. However, the round shape was less space efficient than rectangular designs, with more unusable space near the edges where the walls sloped to meet the ground. The construction and maintenance of these tents required considerable skill and attention. Canvas and linen, while relatively water-resistant when new and properly treated, would deteriorate under the combined assault of weather, mildew, and rough use. Soldiers were expected to inspect their shelters regularly, repairing tears and holes before they could spread, replacing rotted cords and worn grommets, and treating the fabric with oils or waxes to restore its water-shedding properties. In winter camps, snow accumulation posed a constant threat, as the weight of heavy wet snow could bow ridgepoles and snap support stakes, collapsing the tent onto its sleeping occupants. Soldiers learned to knock snow from tent walls regularly, sometimes multiple times during a single heavy snowfall, and to reinforce their structures with additional guy lines when storms were forecast. The art of tent repair was an essential skill for medieval soldiers. A small tear, if left unattended, could quickly spread due to stress on the fabric, eventually rendering the tent unusable. Soldiers carried simple sewing kits, typically consisting of heavy needles, strong thread made from linen or sinew, and perhaps a few squares of spare canvas for patches. Repairing a tent was usually done in daylight hours when the damage could be clearly seen, and the work performed outside in better light than oil lamps could provide inside the tent. The technique for patching a tent involved more than simply sewing a piece of fabric over the hole. First, the torn edges had to be aligned and, if possible, sewn back together. Then a patch, cut slightly larger than the damage area, would be sewn over the tear on both sides of the fabric, essentially sandwiching the torn section between two layers of new material. The stitching had to be tight and regular, with each stitch passing completely through all layers to create a weatherproof seal. After sewing, the patch area would be treated with waterproofing compound, usually a mixture of beeswax and tallow heated until liquid and then brushed onto the fabric. Grommets, the reinforced holes through which guy ropes passed, required regular inspection and occasional replacement. These were typically made of leather rings sewn into the tent fabric at stress points, or in later periods, metal rings hammered into place. When grommets wore out or tore free, they had to be replaced immediately, as the guy ropes would otherwise tear through the unsupported fabric. Replacing a grommet meant cutting away the damaged area, sewing in a new leather reinforcement ring, and ensuring the stitching was strong enough to withstand the pulling force of the guy rope. The placement and orientation of tents within a military camp followed principles that balanced tactical necessity with environmental protection. Whenever possible, camps were established in locations that offered natural windbreaks, such as the lee side of hills or ridges, or within forested areas where trees blocked the worst of the wind. The tents themselves were often oriented with their entrances facing away from prevailing winds and positioned to allow maximum sun exposure during the brief winter days. In established winter quarters, soldiers might enhance their tent's protection by constructing windbreaks from whatever materials were available, such as bundles of brush, walls of stacked firewood, or even low barriers of snow that hardened into ice. Understanding the layout of a medieval military camp helps illustrate how environmental factors were incorporated into planning. Camps were typically organized along regular patterns, with tents arranged in rows or blocks according to military units. This organization served multiple purposes beyond mere orderliness. It allowed for efficient movement through the camp, clear sight lines for security purposes, and equitable distribution of prime camping locations. However, within this overall structure, attention was paid to microtopography and local conditions. The best camping locations, those with natural shelter from wind or proximity to water sources, were typically assigned to higher-ranking officers and their retinues. This reflected the hierarchical nature of medieval society, but it also made practical sense from a military perspective. Officers needed to be able to function effectively, making decisions and providing leadership, and ensuring their comfort was not mere privilege but military necessity. Common soldiers were assigned less favourable locations, but even here, camp organisers tried to provide some equity, rotating units through different camp sections so that no group bore the worst conditions throughout an entire campaign. Some armies took shelter building a step further, creating what might be termed semi-permanent winter structures. When circumstances permitted and the army planned to remain in one location for an extended period, soldiers might excavate shallow pits beneath their tents, lowering the floor level by a foot or two. The excavated earth was then piled around the tent's perimeter, creating an insulating berm that reduced heat loss through the ground and provided additional wind protection. In extreme cases, particularly in regions with harsh winters, armies might construct wooden frames over which tent fabric was stretched, creating hybrid structures that combined the portability of tents with some of the insulating benefits of solid walls. The process of digging these pit shelters was labour-intensive but worthwhile for extended winter camps. Soldiers would use whatever digging tools were available, typically spades or mattocks, to excavate a rectangular depression large enough to accommodate the tent's footprint. The excavation had to be done carefully to avoid undermining the tent stakes, and the pit needed to be deep enough to provide meaningful benefit without becoming dangerously deep. A depth of 18 inches to 2 feet was typical, providing significant thermal advantage while still allowing soldiers to enter and exit easily. The excavated soil was piled around the pit's perimeter, creating a raised berm that served multiple functions. It blocked wind at ground level, where drafts were most likely to penetrate tent walls. It provided additional insulation, as several feet of packed earth formed a barrier against heat transfer, and it helped manage water drainage, directing rainwater or snow melt away from the tent interior rather than allowing it to pool around the living space. These berms were often reinforced with stakes and packed snow, creating semi-permanent structures that lasted throughout the winter season. In some cases, particularly during long sieges or in established winter quarters, soldiers would construct more substantial structures. These might include low walls of stacked stone or turf over which tents were pitched to create hybrid shelters, or they might build simple wooden frames, essentially A-frame structures like house roofs, that provided rigid support for tent fabric and allowed for steeper pitches that shed snow more effectively. Some historical accounts describe soldiers constructing entire wooden cabins and covering them with tent canvas for additional weatherproofing, creating structures that blurred the line between tent and building. The question of how to generate and retain heat within these flimsy shelters occupied much of a soldier's attention during winter campaigns. Open fires inside tents were generally avoided due to the obvious fire hazard and the danger of carbon monoxide poisoning, but medieval soldiers developed numerous alternative heating strategies. The most common solution involved the careful use of braziers, small metal vessels, typically made of iron or bronze, that held burning charcoal. These braziers came in various designs, from simple bowl shapes to more elaborate constructions with perforated lids and stands that kept them elevated above combustible materials. Braziers varied considerably in size and sophistication depending on who owned them and their intended use. The simplest braziers were little more than shallow iron bowls, perhaps 12 to 18 inches in diameter and 4 to 6 inches deep, with 3 or 4 small legs lifting them off the ground. These basic models could be produced by any competent blacksmith and were light enough to be carried easily in an army's baggage train. More elaborate braziers featured decorative elements, perforated sides that allowed better air circulation while still containing the coals, and handles for safe transport when cool. The design of the brazier was crucial to its safe and effective use. The bowl had to be deep enough to contain burning coals while preventing accidental spillage, but shallow enough to allow adequate air circulation to maintain combustion. The perforations in the sides, where present, had to be large enough to admit oxygen but small enough to prevent coals from falling through. The legs needed to be tall enough to create an air gap between the hot metal and the ground or floor, preventing damage to tent floors and reducing the risk of igniting bedding materials. Charcoal was preferred over wood for tent heating because it burned hotter, produced less smoke, and generated more sustained heat per unit of volume. However, obtaining charcoal in sufficient quantities while on campaign presented logistical challenges. Armies travelling through friendly territory might purchase charcoal from local producers. Villages and towns typically had charcoal burners who supplied fuel for smiths and other craftsmen. But in hostile regions or during prolonged sieges, soldiers had to make their own. This required building earthen mounds or kilns, where wood could be slowly combusted under controlled conditions, a process that took several days and required considerable expertise to execute properly. The production of charcoal in field conditions was a specialized skill, usually performed by soldiers who had experience as charcoal burners in civilian life. The process began with selecting appropriate wood, preferably hardwoods like oak, beech, or maple, which produced denser, longer-burning charcoal than softwoods. The wood was cut into uniform lengths, typically 2 to 3 feet long, and split to roughly similar thicknesses to ensure even combustion. The actual charcoal production took place in earthen mounds or simple kilns constructed from available materials. The traditional method involved stacking the wood in a conical pile, with a central chimney created by leaving a vertical gap in the middle. The pile was then covered with layers of earth, leaves, and turf, creating an airtight seal except for the central chimney and a few small air holes near the base. Fire was introduced through the central chimney, and the pile was allowed to smoulder for several days, with the charcoal burner carefully managing the air supply to maintain slow, even combustion without allowing the wood to burst into open flame. The process required constant attention. Too much air, and the wood would burn too quickly, consuming itself entirely rather than being converted to charcoal. Too little air, and the fire would go out before the conversion was complete. The charcoal burner monitored the smoke color and smell, adjusting airflow by opening or closing the vents at the base of the mound. White or grey smoke indicated proper combustion, while yellow smoke suggested too much air and overly rapid burning. The process was complete when the smoke turned blue and nearly transparent, indicating that most of the volatile compounds had been driven off and only carbon remained. When finished, the mound was allowed to cool for several days before being opened. Proper cooling was essential, as premature exposure to air could cause the charcoal to ignite and burn away. Once cool, the charcoal was broken out of the mound, sorted by size, and stored in bags or barrels for distribution to the army. A well-executed charcoal burn might convert a cord of wood into several bushels of charcoal, enough to heat dozens of tents for a week or more. The resulting charcoal was precious, carefully rationed and guarded, as it represented the difference between relative comfort and potentially lethal cold. In armies with formal supply systems, charcoal might be distributed as part of regular rations, with each tent receiving a daily allotment sufficient for several hours of heat. In less organized forces, soldiers had to fend for themselves, purchasing or bartering for charcoal from army sutlers, or trying to produce their own in small batches using whatever materials they could gather. Even with braziers, heating a tent in sub-freezing temperatures required constant attention, and carried significant risks. The brazier had to be positioned carefully, far enough from tent walls and sleeping soldiers to prevent accidental burns or fires, yet close enough to provide warmth to those who needed it. Ventilation was critical. While the tent needed to be sealed against drafts to retain heat, some air circulation was essential to prevent the buildup of carbon monoxide, which could kill silently as soldiers slept. Experienced soldiers learned to recognize the symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning, including headache, dizziness, and nausea, and would immediately increase ventilation if these warning signs appeared. The management of a brazier through the night was a skilled task, often assigned to soldiers on a rotating basis. The brazier needed enough fuel to burn for several hours, but not so much that it overheated the tent or consumed oxygen too quickly. Adding fresh charcoal had to be done carefully, as disturbing the coals could cause them to flare up, and adding too much at once could smother the fire. The soldier tending the brazier had to stay awake to monitor it, positioned near enough to see it in the darkness but not so close as to risk falling asleep and tumbling into the hot coals. The placement of the brazier within the tent required careful consideration. It needed to be central enough to radiate heat evenly, but positioned so soldiers could enter and exit the tent without bumping into it. Many tents had a designated spot for the brazier, marked by stones or a cleared area where soldiers knew to expect it. Some tents used suspended braziers hanging from the ridgepole in a metal cage or basket that kept the hot coals away from any flammable surfaces, while allowing heat to radiate in all directions. An alternative heating method involved heated stones or bricks. Soldiers would place large, smooth stones in a campfire until they were thoroughly heated, then carefully transport them to their tents, wrapped in cloth or leather to prevent burns. These heated stones released their warmth gradually over several hours, providing passive heating without the risks associated with open flames or burning charcoal. However, this method had its own challenges. Finding suitable stones required foraging, and not all stones were safe to heat. Certain types, particularly those that had absorbed water, could explode when rapidly heated, sending sharp fragments flying like shrapnel. Soldiers learned through experience and sometimes through painful accidents which stones could be trusted. The selection of stones for heating was an art learned through observation and passed down from experienced soldiers to newcomers. River stones, smoothed by water action, were generally avoided as they often contained trapped moisture. Granite and other dense igneous rocks were preferred, as their crystal structure was less prone to explosive failure when heated. Soldiers would test unfamiliar stones by gradually heating them, starting at the edge of a fire and slowly moving them closer to the hottest coals, while watching for any signs of cracking or steam emission that would indicate trapped moisture. Once safely heated, these stones became portable heat sources that could be moved around the tent as needed. A soldier with cold feet might position a wrapped stone at the foot of his bedding. Someone suffering from muscle cramps or injuries might hold a stone against the affected area for pain relief. The stones could be reheated multiple times, though each heating cycle gradually weakened the stone structure, and eventually even safe stones would crack and have to be replaced. Some soldiers developed more sophisticated heated stone systems. They might collect a dozen or more suitable stones, heating half of them while the others cooled, then swapping them out to maintain continuous warmth through the night. Or they might create stone platforms, arranging heated stones in a grid pattern and covering them with cloth or leather to create a warm, sleeping surface that retained heat for hours. These platforms had to be constructed carefully to avoid direct contact between skin and hot stones. but when properly made, they provided comfortable warmth without the fire risks of braziers. The practice of communal sleeping was perhaps the single most effective cold weather survival strategy available to medieval soldiers. In the confined space of a military tent, multiple bodies pressed together created a collective warmth that individual soldiers could not generate alone. This was not a matter of comfort or preference, but of survival. Soldiers would sleep in rows, often 3 or 4 men across, their bodies aligned like sardines in a tin. The men in the middle enjoyed the greatest warmth, benefiting from body heat on both sides, while those on the outside faced the dual challenge of cold tent walls and drafts from ground level. Experienced units developed rotation systems, ensuring that no soldier spent the entire night in the coldest positions. The physics of communal sleeping deserve exploration. The human body at rest generates approximately 100 watts of heat, roughly equivalent to a bright incandescent light bulb. While this heat production is modest, it's substantial in the context of a small, enclosed space like a tent. 4 soldiers sleeping together would generate about 400 watts collectively, enough to raise the tent's interior temperature significantly above outside conditions. The key was trapping and retaining this heat, which required minimizing air exchange with the cold exterior while preventing dangerous carbon monoxide buildup from breathing. This close physical proximity created social complications in a culture that placed high value on personal honor and propriety. Medieval society had complex rules governing physical contact between men, and the forced intimacy of tent life required adjustments and accommodations. Over time, soldiers who campaigned together developed bonds of trust and mutual dependence that transcended normal social boundaries. They learned to sleep literally back to back, to share body heat without shame, to huddle together in ways that would have been scandalous in civilian life, but became unremarkable in the field. The sleeping arrangements within a tent followed practical considerations modified by social hierarchy. In tents shared by soldiers of different ranks, the highest-ranking man typically claimed the most desirable sleeping position, usually in the tent's center where he was protected from cold walls and benefited from maximum shared body heat. The arrangement of soldiers around this central position reflected their relative status, with the youngest or lowest-ranking men relegated to the outside positions where cold was most severe. However, this social hierarchy was tempered by practical necessity and fairness. A commander who insisted on the warmest position every night while his men suffered would lose their respect and loyalty. Many experienced officers participated in rotation systems, taking their turn in the cold positions to demonstrate solidarity with their men. This kind of shared sacrifice built unit cohesion and morale in ways that no amount of discipline or formal training could achieve. The actual practice of preparing to sleep in a medieval tent involved numerous small rituals and routines. As darkness fell and the day's activities wound down, soldiers would enter their tents and begin arranging their sleeping spaces. First came the preparation of ground insulation, shaking out straw or hay bedding that had been compressed during the previous night, adding fresh material when available, and ensuring even distribution across the sleeping area. Wet or soiled bedding would be removed and replaced if possible, though in practice soldiers often had to make do with inadequate or deteriorating bedding materials. Next came the arrangement of personal belongings. Weapons and armor had to be positioned where they could be reached quickly in case of alarm, but not where they would be in the way during sleep or could cause injury in the dark. Many soldiers used their packs or rolled cloaks as pillows, elevating their heads to reduce snoring and make breathing easier. Boots and other leather items might be positioned near body warmth to prevent them from freezing stiff overnight, but not so close to braziers or heated stones that they would be damaged by heat. The process of removing or loosening clothing for sleep required careful judgment. Soldiers needed to maintain warmth but also avoid overheating, which would cause sweating that would later chill them as it evaporated. The typical approach was to loosen tight garments that restricted circulation, particularly around waist and ankles, while keeping most clothing on for insulation. Outer layers might be removed and used as additional bedding or blankets, but base layers stayed on. Wet clothing was a particular challenge, as it drew heat away from the body, but removing it meant exposing skin to cold air. The usual solution was to keep wet garments on but loosened, allowing body heat to gradually dry them while minimizing heat loss. The bedding that soldiers used to insulate themselves from the frozen ground was as important as the tent itself. The earth, even when covered with snow, acted as a heat sink, drawing warmth from any body in contact with it. Without adequate insulation, a soldier could develop hypothermia even inside a tent with his companions and a brazier for warmth. The most basic ground insulation consisted of gathered vegetation, such as straw, hay, dried grass, or pine boughs. Soldiers would create thick mats of these materials, 6 inches deep or more, which compressed under body weight but still provided crucial air pockets that reduced thermal conduction. The process of gathering bedding materials was an ongoing activity during winter campaigns. Soldiers would forage for suitable materials whenever the opportunity arose, competing with each other and with army horses for the best straw and hay. Pine boughs were particularly valued in forested regions, as they were relatively easy to gather in winter, and their needles created excellent insulation even when dry. The boughs were layered like shingles, with the cut ends facing down and the bushy tops creating a springy insulating mat. Straw was particularly valued because it was often available even in winter, either from military supply wagons or from requisitioned farm stores. A bed of straw, covered with a cloak or blanket, created a surprisingly effective sleeping platform. The individual straw stems created millions of tiny air pockets that trapped heat and prevented its transfer to the ground. The straw's structure also allowed moisture to evaporate, preventing the dampness that turned cold into truly dangerous conditions. However, straw bedding had to be changed regularly, as compressed and soiled bedding lost its insulating properties and became a source of unpleasant odours and vermin. In established winter camps, soldiers might conduct regular housekeeping that included airing out tents, beating out old straw to fluff it up, and replacing it entirely with fresh material when available. This maintenance was not merely about comfort but about survival, as inadequate bedding meant poor sleep, which led to exhaustion, which compromised the soldier's ability to perform duties and defend himself. The management of bedding materials reflected the broader challenges of maintaining supplies during winter campaigns. Everything wore out faster in winter. Material that would last weeks in summer might barely survive days when subjected to constant moisture, freezing temperatures, and hard use. Soldiers learned to be resourceful, gathering whatever materials came to hand, improvising solutions when standard supplies were unavailable, and sharing resources with tent mates who might be less fortunate or skilled in foraging. Wealthier soldiers and officers might possess sleeping mats made of woven reeds or specially prepared grasses, rolled items that could be transported with the baggage train, and unrolled each night to provide a consistent sleeping surface. These mats were valuable possessions, carefully maintained and guarded against theft. Some were quite elaborate, featuring multiple layers woven together to create thick, cushioning surfaces that provided both insulation and comfort. The best examples might include wool batting between woven layers, creating primitive sleeping pads that served functions similar to modern camping mattresses. Sheepskins and other animal hides represented the premium bedding material, prized possessions that provided excellent insulation and could also serve as cloaks during the day. The wool of sheepskin retained warmth even when damp, a property that made it particularly valuable in winter conditions where condensation inside tents was a constant problem. A soldier lucky enough to possess a sheepskin would guard it jealously, sleeping on it to benefit from its insulation, wearing it as a cloak during the day, and treating it with oils and fats to preserve the leather and maintain the wool's condition. The preparation and maintenance of animal hide bedding required knowledge and effort. Fresh hides had to be properly tanned to prevent rotting and to make them supple enough for comfortable use. This tanning process, while typically performed by professional leather workers before the campaign began, sometimes had to be attempted in field conditions when soldiers obtained fresh hides through hunting or requisition. Field tanning was a crude process, usually involving smoking the hide to preserve it and rubbing it with animal brains or other fatty substances to soften the leather, but it could produce serviceable, if not ideal, results. The different qualities of various animal hides meant that soldiers learned to appreciate the subtle advantages of each type. Sheepskin was warm and soft but relatively fragile and required careful maintenance. Cowhide was much more durable and could serve double duty as ground insulation and armor backing, but it was heavier and less comfortable than sheep or goat skin. Bear hide was extraordinarily warm and water-resistant, but expensive and difficult to obtain except in heavily forested regions. Deer hide was soft and lightweight, but provided less insulation than wooled skins. Each type had its place as a hierarchy of soldier possessions, with soldiers acquiring the best they could afford or manage to obtain. Blankets and cloaks served multiple purposes in the medieval soldier's survival kit. During the day, a heavy wool cloak provided protection from wind and precipitation, while allowing freedom of movement. At night, that same cloak became bedding, either as an underlayer for additional ground insulation or as a covering to trap body heat. Many soldiers possessed multiple cloaks of varying weights, wearing the lighter ones in autumn and spring, and bringing out the heavy winter cloaks only when temperatures dropped to dangerous levels. The construction of medieval cloaks reflected centuries of experience with cold weather gear. The basic design was simple, a semicircular or circular piece of heavy wool fabric, with a hole cut for the neck and some kind of fastening at the throat to keep it closed. However, within this basic framework, numerous variations existed. Some cloaks had hoods attached, providing head protection without the need for a separate hood or cap. Others featured slits for the arms, allowing better freedom of movement while maintaining warmth. The finest cloaks might be lined with additional fabric or even fur, creating layered garments of exceptional warmth. The weight and thickness of cloak fabric varied considerably. Summer cloaks might be woven from relatively fine wool thread, creating lightweight fabric that provided sun protection and warmth against cool evening breezes without causing overheating. Winter cloaks, by contrast, used the thickest wool thread woven as densely as the loom would allow, creating fabric so heavy and thick it could almost stand up by itself. This heavy fabric provided exceptional insulation and wind resistance, and when properly treated with lanolin or other water-resistant substances, it could shed rain and snow surprisingly effectively. The art of wearing a cloak properly was something soldiers learned through experience. Simply draping a cloak over the shoulders provided limited benefit, as wind could blow it open or catch underneath it, defeating its protective purpose. Skilled wearers learned to wrap the cloak around their bodies in ways that trapped air and blocked wind, using their hands to hold it closed or employing various pinning and belting techniques to secure it. At night, a cloak could be spread beneath a soldier as ground insulation, wrapped around him as a blanket, or shared with tent mates to create a larger covering that benefited multiple men. Wool was the miracle fabric of medieval cold weather survival, and understanding its properties helps explain how soldiers managed to survive in conditions that seem impossible to modern observers. Unlike cotton or linen, which lose their insulating properties when wet, wool retains much of its warmth even when soaked through. This is because wool fibers are naturally crimped and scaled, creating tiny air pockets throughout the fabric that trap heat. Additionally, the lanolin that occurs naturally in wool makes it somewhat water repellent, causing liquid water to bead up and run off rather than soaking in immediately. The structure of wool fibers at a microscopic level reveals why they work so well for cold weather insulation. Each fiber is covered with overlapping scales like roof shingles that cause the fibers to lock together when twisted into thread or pressed together in felted fabric. These interlocking fibers create stable air pockets that don't collapse easily under pressure or when the fabric gets wet. The fiber itself is kinked and crimped naturally, adding more air-trapping structure, and the protein composition of wool gives it unique chemical properties that other natural fibers lack. Perhaps most remarkably, wool actually generates heat when it absorbs moisture from the air or from perspiration. This is due to a chemical reaction called the heat of sorption, in which the hydrogen bonds in water molecules are broken as moisture is absorbed into the wool fiber's protein structure, releasing energy in the form of heat. This property meant that a soldier wearing wool clothing would actually feel warmer as his body perspired, rather than becoming chilled by damp fabric. This heat generation was modest, but in marginal conditions it could mean the difference between maintaining core body temperature and sliding into dangerous hypothermia. The processing of wool from raw fleece to finished fabric was a complex process that gave medieval communities an appreciation for this valuable material. Sheep were sheared in spring, and their fleeces were washed to remove dirt and excess lanolin, though some lanolin was deliberately left to maintain the wool's water-resistant properties. The cleaned wool was then carded or combed to align the fibers and remove tangles, a tedious process done by hand using wooden implements with bent wire teeth. The aligned fibers were then spun into thread using drop spindles or spinning wheels, and the thread was woven into fabric on looms. The quality of wool fabric varied enormously, depending on the quality of the raw wool and the skill of the workers who processed it. The finest wool came from specific breeds of sheep, particularly the merino sheep of Spain, whose fleeces produced exceptionally soft, fine fibers. Coarser wool from other breeds produced rougher fabric, more suitable for outer garments where softness was less important than durability and water resistance. The thread count and weaving pattern also affected the final fabric's properties, with tightly woven fabric providing better wind resistance, while looser weaves created softer, more drapable material. The typical medieval soldier's winter clothing consisted of multiple layers, each serving a specific function. Next to the skin, many soldiers wore a linen undershirt or chemise. While linen lacked wool's warming properties, it served the important function of wicking perspiration away from the skin and providing a comfortable layer between wool garments and potentially sensitive skin. Wool worn directly against skin could be itchy and irritating, particularly the coarser varieties available to common soldiers, and the linen underlayer provided a barrier that made wool garments more tolerable. The linen chemise or undershirt was typically a simple garment, basically a long shirt that reached to mid-thigh or below, with long sleeves and a round or split neckline. It was usually made from relatively fine linen, as comfort was its primary function. Better quality chemises might have some decorative elements, like embroidered necklines or cuffs, but for soldiers, plain and functional was the norm. The chemise was worn day and night, essentially living in it for the duration of a campaign, which meant it bore the brunt of body soil and required regular washing when circumstances permitted. Over the linen chemise came one or more wool tunics. The inner tunic, if a soldier possessed multiple layers, was typically made of medium-weight wool, closer fitting than the outer garments to trap body heat near the skin. This tunic might reach to knee length or below, with long sleeves that extended to the wrists. The neckline was usually simple, either a round neck or a short slit that could be laced closed for warmth. A belt or girdle worn around the waist allowed the tunic to be bloused, creating additional dead air space that improved insulation. The outer tunic, worn over the inner tunic when temperatures demanded extra layers, was made of heavier wool and cut more loosely to accommodate the layers beneath. This garment served as the primary visible clothing, and for soldiers who could afford it, might feature some decoration or identifying elements like coloured trim or embroidered badges. However, for most common soldiers, the outer tunic was plain and practical, valued for warmth and durability rather than appearance. The loose cut allowed freedom of movement while still providing wind protection and insulation. The art of layering these garments effectively was something soldiers learned through experience. Too many layers, and the soldier would overheat during physical activity, sweating profusely and soaking his clothing. When activity stopped, this damp clothing would chill him rapidly, potentially causing hypothermia. Too few layers, and the soldier would be uncomfortably cold even at rest, unable to generate enough body heat to stay warm. The ideal approach involved wearing enough layers to stay comfortable when moderately active, then adding or removing the outer cloak or adjusting clothing to suit changing conditions. Over the tunics, soldiers wore hose, essentially fitted leggings that covered each leg separately. These were typically made of wool and were supported by ties that attached to a belt or girdle worn around the waist. The hose extended from the foot to the upper thigh, providing insulation for the legs while allowing more freedom of movement than would be possible with loose trousers. Some hose included leather soles, eliminating the need for separate shoes in mild conditions, though in winter, soldiers generally wore sturdy leather boots over their hose. The construction of hose required skill in cutting and sewing, as they needed to fit relatively closely to function properly, but not so tightly that they restricted circulation or movement. The fabric was typically cut on the bias, meaning at an angle to the weave, which gave it some stretch and helped it conform to leg shape. The hose were sewn up the back of the leg, with some designs featuring gauze or shaped pieces that created a better fit around the calf and thigh. At the top they attached to the belt with ties called points, essentially strong cords that passed through eyelets in the hose and the belt. The question of footwear deserves particular attention, as frostbitten toes were one of the most common cold weather injuries in medieval armies. Leather boots, while providing some protection from the elements, had significant limitations. Leather is not naturally waterproof, and once soaked, it provides little insulation and actually conducts heat away from the foot. Medieval soldiers learned to treat their boots with animal fats or oils, which improved water resistance but required constant reapplication. They also learned the importance of dry socks, typically made of wool, and would carry spare pairs when possible, drying wet socks by wearing them inside their tunics, close to their body where heat and air circulation could evaporate the moisture. The design of medieval military footwear varied considerably depending on period, region, and the soldier's wealth. The most basic footwear was simple leather shoes, essentially shaped pieces of leather sewn together and attached to the foot with laces or straps. These provided minimal protection but were better than nothing. More substantial were boots that extended up the calf or even to the knee, providing protection not just for the foot but for the lower leg as well. The finest boots might be made from multiple pieces of carefully shaped leather with reinforced soles, padded linings, and elaborate lacing systems. Keeping feet warm was a constant struggle, and soldiers developed various strategies to protect their extremities. When stationary in camp, they might wear wooden pattens, essentially platforms that elevated the feet above cold, wet ground. These patterns were simple constructions, usually just a wooden sole with leather straps that held them onto the boot, but they were remarkably effective at preventing cold and moisture from soaking up through the boot soles. Some soldiers wrapped their feet in extra cloth, or even stuffed their boots with dry grass or wool scraps for additional insulation, though this had to be done carefully as overly tight footwear could restrict blood circulation, actually increasing the risk of frostbite. The circulation of blood to extremities was crucial for preventing cold injuries, though medieval soldiers understood this only through observation and experience, not through modern medical knowledge. They knew that tight boots or bindings caused feet to become cold more quickly. They learned that keeping feet elevated when possible helped prevent swelling and coldness. They discovered that gentle movement, flexing toes and ankles, helped maintain warmth, and they passed this practical knowledge from veteran to recruit, creating an informal education in cold weather survival that saved countless feet from frostbite damage. Hands presented similar challenges to feet, but with the added complication that soldiers needed to use their hands for a wide variety of tasks that required dexterity. Heavy gloves or mittens, while warm, made handling weapons and equipment difficult. Many soldiers used a layered approach, wearing thin leather gloves that allowed dexterity while providing some protection from cold, and carrying heavy mittens made of wool or fur-lined leather that could be donned when manual dexterity wasn't required. These mittens were often attached to the soldier's belt or cloak by cords, preventing loss during the confusion of battle or march. The design of mittens versus gloves reflected the trade-off between warmth and dexterity. Mittens, with all fingers together in one compartment, were warmer because the fingers could share heat. Gloves, with separate finger compartments, allowed much better manual dexterity, but were colder because each finger was isolated and lost heat to the surrounding air. Some medieval designs tried to bridge this gap with convertible mittens that had a flap that could be folded back to expose individual fingers when needed, then closed again for warmth. The materials used in hand protection varied from simple wool mittens knitted or sewn by the soldiers themselves or by their families, to elaborate fur-lined leather gloves that might cost a month's pay or more. The best gloves combined multiple materials to get the advantages of each. Leather on the palms and working surfaces for durability and grip, wool or fur on the backs and inside for warmth, and long cuffs that extended up the forearms to prevent cold from penetrating at the wrist. The head and neck, which lose heat rapidly due to high blood flow near the surface, received special attention. The hood, called a chaperon in some regions, was a crucial piece of cold weather gear. This was a soft cap that extended down to cover the neck and could be pulled up over the chin and lower face when wind was severe. Hoods were typically made of wool and were often attached to or integrated with the soldier's cloak or outer tunic. In extreme cold, soldiers might wrap an additional wool scarf or length of cloth around their face, leaving only their eyes exposed. The design of hoods evolved throughout the medieval period, with different regional and class variations. The simplest hoods were basically bags of wool fabric with a hole for the face and a gathering at the back to allow them to hang down in a point when not pulled up. More elaborate hoods featured liripipes, long tails that could be wrapped around the neck for additional warmth, or used as a kind of belt or decorative element. Some hoods had built-in shoulder capes that provided extra protection for the neck and upper chest area. The practice of covering the face in extreme cold had to be balanced against the need to see and breathe effectively. Cloth wrapped too tightly around the face would quickly become soaked with condensation from breathing, and could actually increase the risk of frostbite. Soldiers learned to leave small breathing gaps and to adjust their face coverings regularly, loosening them when they became too damp, allowing them to dry a bit, then repositioning them. This constant adjustment was another of the small, tedious tasks that filled a soldier's day during winter campaigns. Maintaining body heat required more than just passive insulation from clothing and shelters. Medieval soldiers had to actively generate heat through movement and metabolic processes, which meant consuming adequate calories and staying properly hydrated despite challenging conditions. The fuel for this internal furnace came from food, and the importance of adequate nutrition during winter campaigns cannot be overstated. A body struggling to maintain core temperature in sub-freezing conditions burns calories at an accelerated rate, and soldiers who were underfed became susceptible to hypothermia even when adequately clothed and sheltered. The basic ration for a medieval soldier varied considerably depending on time period, region, and the army's supply situation, but certain staples appeared with remarkable consistency. Bread or hard biscuit formed the foundation of most military diets, providing carbohydrates that could be quickly converted to energy. These biscuits, sometimes called hardtack in later periods, were deliberately baked to remove as much moisture as possible, creating a product that could survive for months without spoiling, but required strong teeth and often needed to be soaked in water or wine to become edible. A soldier might receive a pound or more of bread daily, supplemented by other foods when available. The production of military bread or biscuit was a significant logistical undertaking. Flour had to be milled from grain, transported to wherever the army was located, and then baked into bread or biscuit. In established camps or during sieges of cities, professional bakers might be employed to produce bread using proper ovens. But in field conditions, soldiers often had to bake their own bread using makeshift ovens constructed from stones or earth, or simply by cooking dough on hot stones or metal plates placed in the fire. The quality of military bread varied enormously. In the best circumstances, it might be made from fine wheat flour, properly leavened and baked to create a nutritious and relatively palatable product. More commonly, especially late in campaigns when supplies were running low, the bread might be made from a mixture of whatever grains were available, including barley, rye, or even peas and beans ground into flour. This mixed grain bread was heavy, dense, and often had an unpleasant taste, but it provided calories and kept soldiers alive, which was ultimately what mattered. Hardtack or ship's biscuit, when that was what soldiers received, was an even less appealing but more durable option. These were thick wafers of flour and water with no leavening, baked until they were rock hard and almost completely dry. The result was virtually indestructible, capable of surviving years of storage without spoiling, but also almost inedible in its natural state. Soldiers would soak hardtack in water, beer, wine, or soup to soften it, or break it into pieces and add it to stews where the liquid and long cooking would eventually make it palatable. Some soldiers would fry soaked hardtack in fat, creating a kind of primitive French toast that was more filling and flavorful than the biscuit alone. Dried or salted meat provided essential protein and fats. Bacon, essentially salt-cured pork, was particularly valued because the high fat content meant that even small portions provided significant calories, crucial when fuel for the body's internal heating system was measured in every mouthful. Soldiers would often receive their bacon ration as part of a weekly or monthly distribution, and they learned to make it last through careful portioning. A strip of bacon, rendered slowly over a fire until the fat liquefied, could flavour an entire pot of grain porridge, extending the meat's value while providing warming nourishment. The process of salt-curing meat was one of the primary preservation methods available to medieval people. Fresh meat, which spoiled rapidly even in cold weather, was packed in salt or submerged in brine, where the high salt concentration drew out moisture and created an environment hostile to bacteria. The result was meat that could be stored for months or even years, though the salt content was so high that the meat had to be soaked in fresh water before cooking to make it edible. This soaking leached out some of the salt but also removed flavour and nutrients, leaving meat that was often tough and bland but still provided valuable protein and fat. Different types of meat were preserved and issued to soldiers based on availability and regional preferences. Pork was most common in much of Europe, as pigs were efficient converters of food waste into meat and could be raised easily in most regions. Beef appeared in military rations in cattle-raising areas, though it was generally considered inferior to pork for preservation purposes, as it tended to become tough and stringy when salt-cured. Mutton or goat meat appeared in regions where sheep and goats were the primary livestock. In coastal areas or near major rivers, preserved fish might be part of military rations, with salt cod being particularly common, as it could be dried and salted to create a product that lasted indefinitely. Dried beans and peas, sometimes called pulse, appeared in military provisions throughout the medieval period. These legumes had numerous advantages. They could be stored for extended periods, they provided protein and fibre, and they could be prepared in a variety of ways. The most common preparation was as pottage, essentially a thick stew or porridge made by boiling the legumes with water and whatever else was available. Scraps of meat, wild herbs, vegetables when they could be obtained. Pottage was warming, filling, and could be kept simmering over a low fire throughout the day, with soldiers helping themselves to bowls whenever they needed sustenance. The preparation of pottage was both an art and a science, refined through centuries of experience. The basic process was simple. Dried beans or peas were soaked overnight to soften them, then simmered for several hours until they broke down into a thick porridge-like consistency. However, good pottage required more than just boiling legumes. Herbs and seasonings improved flavour dramatically, and soldiers would forage for wild herbs like thyme, sage, or garlic where they could be found. Meat scraps or rendered fat added richness and calories. Grain could be added to stretch the pottage further and thicken it. Salt was essential both for flavour and for preserving the pottage if it needed to last more than a day. The communal pot of pottage became a central feature of military camp life. Small groups of soldiers, typically those who shared a tent, would pool their rations and cook together. This communal cooking had several advantages beyond mere efficiency. It created meals that were more varied and palatable than what individuals could manage on their own. It reinforced social bonds, as preparing and sharing food together created a sense of fellowship and mutual obligation. It allowed for redistribution of resources, with those who had extra contributing more to the pot, while those who had less still received adequate portions. And it provided a focus for social activity, as soldiers gathered around the cooking fire to talk, joke, and share news while waiting for their meal to cook. The vessels used for cooking varied depending on what was available. Iron pots were ideal, as they could be placed directly in the fire and were durable enough to withstand years of hard use. Bronze or brass pots were lighter but more expensive, and in some regions clay pots were used, though they were fragile and prone to cracking when subjected to rapid temperature changes. Soldiers who didn't have access to proper cooking pots might improvise, using their helmets as makeshift vessels, though this practice was frowned upon as it damaged the helmet's interior and could introduce contamination into food. The size of cooking pots varied from small vessels that served 2 or 3 men to massive cauldrons that could feed an entire company. These large communal cooking vessels were part of the army's baggage train, transported in wagons or on pack animals, and set up in central cooking areas where professional cooks might prepare food for distribution. This centralized cooking system had advantages in terms of efficiency and quality control, but required organization and discipline that not all medieval armies possessed. In winter camps, the preparation of food became a communal activity that served social as well as nutritional functions. Small groups of soldiers, typically those who shared a tent, would pool their rations and cook together. This allowed for more efficient use of firewood, which was often in short supply during winter campaigns, and created meals that were more varied and palatable than what individuals could manage on their own. The fire itself became a gathering point, a source of warmth where men could dry wet clothing, repair equipment, and share news and rumours while their evening meal cooked. The scheduling of meals during winter campaigns reflected both practical constraints and military tradition. In many medieval armies, there was no formal breakfast, with soldiers expected to begin their day's work on empty stomachs, or perhaps with a piece of bread left over from the previous day. The main meal came at midday, when work paused and soldiers could gather around fires to eat and warm themselves. A smaller evening meal might be provided, though in practice many soldiers simply continued eating from the communal pottage pot throughout the evening, taking bowls as they felt hungry. This meal schedule seems harsh by modern standards, but it reflected the realities of medieval life more broadly, where 2 meals a day was normal even for civilians. The midday meal being the main meal made sense in an agricultural society, where work began at dawn and the heaviest labour came in the morning hours. By midday, workers had expended significant energy and needed substantial nourishment to continue through the afternoon. The evening meal was lighter because there were fewer hours of work remaining, and a full stomach could interfere with sleep. However, winter warfare modified this schedule in important ways. The cold increased caloric requirements significantly, and soldiers working outdoors in freezing temperatures simply couldn't function well on 2 meals a day. Many commanders recognized this and authorized additional rations, or at least looked the other way when soldiers supplemented their diet through foraging or from their own private supplies. The communal pottage pot, kept simmering throughout the day, allowed soldiers to eat whenever they needed energy, creating a more flexible feeding system better suited to winter conditions. The availability of hot drinks was another crucial element of winter survival. While the modern soldier relies on coffee or tea, medieval soldiers made do with whatever was available. Hot water by itself provided some warming benefit, and was safer to drink than cold water in many cases. Water heated with herbs created simple teas that added flavour and might provide some medicinal benefits. But the preferred hot drinks were beer and wine, heated in pots near the fire until steaming. Beer and wine, when available, were preferred to plain water for several reasons. These beverages provided calories in addition to hydration. Their alcohol content offered some protection against waterborne pathogens that medieval people couldn't see but had learned through observation could cause illness, and they improved morale in ways that water simply couldn't match. The beer and wine consumed by common soldiers were relatively low in alcohol, more akin to modern small beer or table wine, which meant they could be consumed in quantity without causing intoxication. In winter conditions, a hot drink made from heated wine or beer, often spiced with precious herbs when available, provided immediate warming and a psychological boost to soldiers facing another cold night. The preparation of these hot drinks was a simple matter of heating liquid in a pot near the fire, but there were refinements that experienced soldiers learned. Wine heated too quickly or too much would lose its alcohol content and develop an unpleasant taste, so it needed to be warmed gently. Beer could separate if heated improperly, with the solids settling out and the liquid becoming thin and watery. Adding spices like cinnamon, cloves, or ginger not only improved flavour, but could help disguise the off-taste that developed in wine or beer that had been stored too long or in poor conditions. In some armies, particularly those from wine-producing regions, mulled wine became a cherished tradition during winter campaigns. The basic recipe was simple: wine heated with honey for sweetness, and whatever spices could be obtained, usually cinnamon and cloves if available. The result was a warming drink that provided both physical and psychological comfort. The honey added significant calories, important for maintaining body heat, and the spices had mild stimulant properties that helped soldiers stay alert during long cold watches. More importantly, the ritual of preparing and sharing mulled wine created a sense of occasion, a moment of pleasure and fellowship that broke the monotony of winter camp life. Water, despite being literally frozen all around them in the form of snow and ice, was a constant concern for winter armies. Melting snow for drinking water is energy-intensive, requiring significant fuel, and produces relatively little water for the amount of snow processed. Ice, when available, was more efficient as its higher density meant more water per unit volume, but accessing ice often meant breaking through frozen surfaces with axes or other tools. Medieval armies camped near streams or rivers whenever possible, as running water was less likely to freeze solid and provided easier access to drinking water. The process of melting snow or ice for water consumption was straightforward but tedious. A pot would be filled with snow or ice and placed near or over a fire. As the snow melted, more would be added, gradually filling the pot with water. The inefficiency came from the fact that snow is mostly air, so a pot full of snow might produce only a small amount of water. Experienced soldiers learned to pack the snow as tightly as possible into the pot, and to select wet, heavy snow over dry, fluffy snow when they had a choice, as the denser snow yielded more water. The quality of melted snow and ice water was generally good, as the freezing process had effectively purified it, but soldiers still exercised caution about where they gathered snow. Snow from the ground might be contaminated with dirt or animal waste, so cleaner snow from higher surfaces was preferred. The first snow of a storm was sometimes avoided. As medieval observers had noticed, it often had a sooty or dirty quality, likely from atmospheric pollutants. Ice from rivers or streams had to be examined carefully, as it might be thin or weak in some areas, creating danger for soldiers gathering it. However, Even in winter, water quality was a concern. Medieval medical theory, influenced by ancient Greek and Roman understanding, held that bad air and corrupted water caused disease, and while the specific mechanism wasn't understood, soldiers had learned through observation that drinking from certain sources led to illness. Rivers downstream from towns or camps were viewed with suspicion, and soldiers preferred to draw water upstream from their camp when possible. Some armies made efforts to purify water by boiling it, though this was primarily done as part of preparing hot drinks or food rather than as a deliberate sanitation measure. The availability of fresh water was one of the primary factors in selecting camp locations. An army without adequate water would quickly become unable to function, as dehydration impairs physical and mental performance even in cold weather. While the risk of heat-related dehydration was lower in winter than in summer, soldiers still needed to drink regularly to replace fluid lost through breathing in cold, dry air, perspiring during physical labor, and normal bodily functions. Commanders learned to identify locations where water would remain accessible throughout winter, looking for springs that flowed year-round, fast-moving streams less likely to freeze completely, or areas where they could dig shallow wells to access groundwater. The social organization of medieval military camps reflected the rigid hierarchical structure of medieval society, and this hierarchy extended to matters of winter survival. Officers and nobles possessed resources and privileges that made winter campaigning significantly more bearable. They might have larger, better constructed tents with multiple rooms and furnishings that included actual beds, chairs, and tables. They had access to portable braziers of finer manufacture, often with decorative elements and more sophisticated designs that burned fuel more efficiently. They employed servants to maintain fires, prepare food, and attend to their personal needs. And they had first claim on better rations, with access to foods that common soldiers rarely saw. Fresh meat, fine bread, wine of better quality, imported delicacies. Some wealthy commanders travelled with entire households, including cooks who prepared elaborate meals, body servants who helped with dressing and personal hygiene, craftsmen who maintained equipment and made repairs, and even musicians or other entertainers who provided diversion during the long winter evenings. For these commanders, winter campaigning, while certainly less pleasant than staying in a comfortable castle, was not the desperate struggle for survival that common soldiers experienced. They could maintain something approximating their normal standard of living, sheltered from the worst of winter's hardship by wealth and privilege. This disparity in living conditions was simply accepted as the natural order of things in medieval society, where hierarchy was viewed as divinely ordained, and any suggestion that people of different social ranks should be treated equally would have seemed absurd. However, this doesn't mean that soldiers were indifferent to the inequity. Grumbling about officers' privileges was as old as military service itself, and commanders who flaunted their comfort while their men suffered risked losing the loyalty and respect that made effective command possible. For common soldiers, the experience was far more austere. They relied on issued or individually purchased equipment, shared crowded tents with multiple companions, and often had to fend for themselves when supplies ran short. Yet this hardship forged bonds of mutual dependence that transcended the usual class distinctions of medieval society. Soldiers who had survived winter campaigns together formed tight-knit groups bound by shared suffering and mutual obligation. They looked out for each other in ways that went beyond formal military structure, sharing extra food with a companion who was sick, taking on another's duties when he was too exhausted to perform them, keeping watch to ensure no one froze to death in his sleep. These informal support networks were crucial to survival. A soldier who became seriously ill or injured could not depend on formal military medical services, which ranged from limited to non-existent depending on the army. Instead, he relied on his tent mates and unit companions to care for him, to ensure he received his rations even when he couldn't fetch them himself, to keep him warm when fever or injury left him vulnerable to cold. This mutual care was not altruistic in any abstract sense, but practical recognition that any soldier might find himself in need of help, and that survival depended on reciprocal obligations honoured faithfully. The daily routine in a winter military camp was shaped by the short daylight hours and the constant need to maintain warmth. Soldiers would rise before dawn, roused by officers or designated sentries, and immediately set about the tasks necessary for survival. Fires had to be rekindled or fed with fresh fuel if they had been maintained through the night. Frost had to be shaken from tent walls before it melted and soaked the fabric. Equipment had to be checked and prepared for the day's activities, whether that meant drill and training, foraging expeditions, construction of fortifications, or actual combat. The process of waking in a winter camp was never pleasant. Soldiers would emerge from sleep reluctantly, their bodies stiff from cold and cramped sleeping positions. The first moments after waking were often the coldest, as the warmth generated by multiple bodies sleeping together dissipated as soon as men began to move and separate. The tent interior, if it had been heated by a brazier through the night, would have cooled considerably by dawn, as the last coals died and the small heat they generated was lost to the cold surrounding air. Breathing created clouds of vapour that hung in the frigid air, and any exposed skin prickled painfully in the cold. The first priority was always fire. Without fire, there was no warmth, no way to prepare food, no means of drying wet clothing or equipment. Rekindling a fire from overnight coals required skill, as the embers had to be carefully uncovered, blown to red heat, and fed with kindling in just the right sequence to coax flames back to life. If the fire had gone completely out, starting it fresh required more effort, using flint and steel to strike sparks into tinder, then carefully building the fire from that initial spark. The materials used for starting fires were precious and carefully guarded. Flint, a hard stone that produced sparks when struck with steel, was one of the most important pieces of equipment a soldier owned. A small piece of steel, often an old knife blade or specially made fire steel, was struck against the flint to produce sparks. These sparks fell into tinder, extremely fine, dry material that would catch fire from the smallest spark. The best tinder was charred cloth, fabric that had been partially burned, then preserved in an airtight container. This charred cloth would catch the tiniest spark and begin to smoulder, allowing the soldier to transfer it to a bundle of fine, dry grass or shredded bark where it could be blown into flame. The process required patience and practice. Wet or damp tinder wouldn't catch, so keeping tinder dry was essential. The sparks from flint and steel had to land precisely on the tinder, requiring good hand-eye coordination, and the transition from smouldering tinder to actual flame was the moment when many fire-starting attempts failed, as too much air would extinguish the spark while too little would prevent it from spreading to larger fuel. Experienced soldiers could start a fire reliably in just a few minutes, but newcomers might struggle for half an hour or more, their cold, numb fingers making the delicate work even more difficult. Once a fire was established, the morning routine continued with personal necessities. Soldiers had to relieve themselves, a simple act made complicated by cold and the need to avoid fouling the camp. Designated latrines were dug on the camp's perimeter, essentially trenches covered with planks or logs that soldiers squatted over. In winter, these latrines were brutal experiences, with cold air in places normally protected, and soldiers learned to make their visits as brief as possible. Some armies required latrines to be covered with earth daily and new trenches dug, a sanitation measure that prevented disease but created additional work for soldiers already burdened with survival tasks. Breakfast, when there was one, was often a simple affair. Perhaps some bread soaked in beer or wine, a bowl of leftover pottage from the previous night, or just a piece of dried meat chewed as soldiers prepared themselves for the day. In many medieval armies, there was no formal breakfast, with soldiers expected to wait until midday for their first substantial meal. This might seem harsh, but it reflected both practical limitations on food preparation and a cultural attitude toward eating that differed from modern assumptions. The daylight hours were filled with activity, partly because work needed to be done, but also because physical movement was necessary to maintain body heat. Soldiers would drill with their weapons, practice formations, maintain equipment, forage for firewood and food, repair fortifications, or work on improving their camp's infrastructure. In established winter quarters, soldiers might engage in more substantial construction projects, building wooden structures to supplement their tents, constructing communal kitchens and latrines, even erecting defensive walls around their camp perimeter. The types of work assigned to soldiers varied depending on the military situation and the season's demands. In armies conducting active siege operations, soldiers might be required to dig trenches and tunnels, construct siege engines, or maintain constant watch on enemy fortifications. These were exhausting tasks made more difficult by frozen ground and limited daylight, but they had to be done regardless of conditions. In armies in winter quarters, waiting out the season before resuming campaigning, the work might be less urgent but no less necessary. Gathering and processing firewood, hunting and foraging for supplemental food, maintaining and repairing equipment, constructing permanent structures to improve winter comfort. The gathering of firewood was one of the most constant and important tasks facing winter armies. Adequate fuel for heating and cooking was essential for survival, and an army of even moderate size could exhaust local wood supplies rapidly. Foraging parties would be sent out daily, sometimes travelling several miles from camp to find uncut forests, cutting and hauling back enormous quantities of wood that would be consumed with alarming speed. The work was back-breaking, requiring soldiers to fell trees, cut them into manageable lengths and carry or drag the wood back to camp, all while dealing with cold, snow, and the ever-present risk of getting lost or being ambushed by enemy forces. The selection of firewood required knowledge and judgment. Hardwoods like oak, beech, maple, and ash burned longer and hotter than softwoods, making them preferred for cooking and overnight heating. But hardwoods were harder to cut and split, requiring more labour to process. Softwoods like pine, spruce, and fir ignited more easily and burned faster, making them useful for starting fires and providing quick heat, but they consumed more rapidly and provided less total heat than equivalent amounts of hardwood. Dead-standing trees were preferred over green wood, as they were already dry and would burn more efficiently, but dead wood could be scarce in heavily foraged areas. The amount of wood required to keep an army warm and fed through winter was staggering. A single cooking fire for a small group of soldiers might consume 20 pounds of wood per day. A brazier burning charcoal might use 10 pounds of charcoal, which required perhaps 30 pounds of wood to produce. Multiply this by hundreds or thousands of soldiers, Add the wood needed for campfires, for blacksmiths and other craftsmen, for drying clothing and equipment, and the total could reach several tons per day. An army planning to camp in one location throughout winter had to carefully assess whether local wood supplies could sustain them, and many winter camps were abandoned not because of military pressure, but simply because they had exhausted all easily accessible fuel. The processing of firewood was work that never ended. Cut logs had to be split into smaller pieces that would burn efficiently, a task requiring axes and wedges and considerable strength and skill. The split wood had to be stacked in ways that allowed air circulation for drying while providing protection from precipitation. Some wood had to be kept under cover, dry and ready for immediate use, while the bulk of the supply could be stored in larger stacks that dried gradually. Soldiers learned to create wood stacks that shed water, with the pieces positioned to direct rain and snowmelt away from the stack's interior. The question of discipline in winter camps was complex. On one hand, the rigors of winter made strict discipline more difficult to maintain. Soldiers weakened by cold and poor nutrition were less able to meet the physical demands of military life. The crowded, uncomfortable conditions created tensions that could explode into violence. The darkness and isolation made it easier for soldiers to slip away from camp, either to desert entirely or to engage in unauthorized foraging that might lead to conflicts with local populations. Yet discipline remained essential for survival. Without it, camps would descend into chaos, with every man looking out only for himself. Shared duties like gathering firewood, fetching water, standing watch, and maintaining fortifications required coordination and cooperation that only discipline could ensure. Commanders walked a fine line, maintaining enough control to keep their forces functional, while recognizing that winter hardships required some relaxation of peacetime standards. Punishments for violations of discipline range from mild to severe. Minor infractions might earn extra guard duty, an unpleasant consequence in winter when standing motionless in the cold for hours could be genuinely dangerous. More serious offences could result in corporal punishment, flogging being a common penalty in many medieval armies, where the soldier was tied to a post or tree and whipped with a leather strap or rod. The pain and humiliation were intended to deter future misbehaviour, both by the punished soldier and by others who witnessed it. The most serious crimes, particularly desertion or betrayal, could be punished by death, though commanders were often reluctant to execute soldiers during winter campaigns when every able body was needed. Desertion was a constant problem in medieval armies, where soldiers might have been pressed into service against their will or found the conditions intolerable. Winter made desertion both more tempting, as the misery of camp life made any alternative seem attractive, and more dangerous, as a soldier fleeing through winter countryside faced all the same survival challenges with none of the support of organized camp life. The threat of punishment, combined with the social pressure of unit cohesion, generally proved sufficient to maintain functional discipline even under difficult conditions. Soldiers understood that their survival depended on cooperation and mutual support, and this practical reality reinforced formal discipline. A soldier who shirked his duties might not be formally punished, but would find himself excluded from the informal networks of mutual aid that made winter survival possible, a potentially more severe consequence than any official penalty. The end of winter brought its own challenges. The thaw could turn camps into mud-soaked nightmares as frozen ground softened and drainage became impossible. Roads became impassable quagmires, making resupply difficult even as the return of warmer weather made movement theoretically possible again. This transition period, what military historians sometimes call the mud season, could be almost as challenging as deep winter, though at least the deadly cold had released its grip. For armies that had managed to maintain themselves through winter, spring brought opportunities for renewed operations. Soldiers who had survived winter together were hardened veterans, their physical and mental toughness proven by ordeal. They had learned to function as a unit under the worst conditions, developing the trust and coordination that made effective military operations possible. Commanders who had successfully managed winter campaigns had demonstrated competence that earned them the loyalty and confidence of their men. Yet winter also took its toll. Even successful winter campaigns resulted in losses from disease, exposure, and the general attrition of hard living. Soldiers emerged from winter weakened, often suffering from scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies brought on by months of inadequate diet. Their equipment was worn and damaged, requiring repair or replacement, and the army as a whole needed to be reorganized and retrained after the inevitable disruptions of winter camp life. The historical record preserves numerous examples of winter campaigns that illuminate the challenges and strategies we've discussed. The winter of 1241 to 1242, when the Mongol army under Batu Khan invaded Hungary and Poland, provides a striking example of successful cold weather operations. The Mongols, coming from the steppes of Central Asia, possessed sophisticated understanding of winter warfare. Their armies travelled with large herds of livestock that provided both food and a source of warm blood, which Mongol soldiers would drink when other food was scarce. They wore layered clothing of wool and fur, designed to trap heat while allowing freedom of movement. Most importantly, the Mongols maintained discipline and unit cohesion even under extreme conditions, their forces remaining effective throughout the winter campaign season, when European armies typically ceased operations. The success of Mongol winter operations owed much to their cultural background. As nomadic herders, the Mongols spent their entire lives in conditions that would have seemed impossibly harsh to settled agricultural peoples. They were accustomed to living in felt tents called gers or yurts, shelters that, while portable, provided excellent insulation through their felt covering and compact design. They knew how to survive on meagre rations, how to maintain their equipment under harsh conditions, and how to keep moving even when European armies would have halted to seek shelter. The Mongol invasion of Europe demonstrated that winter warfare was not impossible, but required specialized knowledge and adaptation. The European armies that tried to stop the Mongols found themselves at a severe disadvantage, unable to match the invaders' mobility and resilience in winter conditions. However, the Mongols ultimately withdrew from Europe not because of military defeat, but due to political changes in their homeland, leaving European military thinkers to ponder the lessons of the campaign. The Crusades provide numerous examples of European armies learning harsh lessons about winter warfare in unfamiliar environments. The First Crusade's siege of Antioch, which lasted from October 1097 through June 1098, forced the Crusader army to endure a winter in Syria under conditions for which most of them were unprepared. The Crusaders, primarily from France and Italy, found themselves besieging a well-fortified city, while simultaneously being blockaded by Muslim relief forces. Winter brought cold rain and occasional snow to the region, and the Crusader army suffered terrible losses from starvation and disease. Contemporary chronicles describe soldiers dying in their tents, horses being slaughtered for food when all other provisions were exhausted, and the army being reduced to eating anything remotely edible, including leather from equipment and grass from fields. The army's survival through this winter siege was a near-run thing, and many historians consider it one of the most remarkable feats of endurance in medieval military history. The factors that allowed survival included the soldiers' religious motivation, which provided psychological resilience in the face of extreme hardship, the emergence of effective leadership that organized the army to manage scarce resources, and ultimately the arrival of supplies by sea that prevented total starvation. The siege of Antioch also illustrated the importance of logistics and supply in winter warfare. The Crusader army had exhausted local food supplies early in the siege and found itself unable to forage effectively due to Muslim control of the surrounding countryside. Without a reliable supply line back to Constantinople, or access to ports where supplies could be delivered by sea, the army was slowly starving. The eventual relief of this situation came through diplomatic arrangements that allowed supply ships to reach nearby ports, demonstrating that military success in winter often depended as much on political and economic factors as on tactical skill. The 100 Years' War between England and France provides numerous examples of winter campaigns and their challenges. The winter of 1359 to 1360, known as Black Monday for the terrible storm that struck the English army, saw Edward III leading a large force through France in what became one of the most miserable campaigns of the war. The English army, well equipped and well supplied by the standards of the time, nonetheless suffered terribly from cold, wet weather that turned roads to mud and made movement agonizingly slow. The storm of Black Monday, which struck on April 13, 1360, was so severe that it convinced Edward to accept a negotiated peace rather than continue the campaign. Contemporary accounts describe hailstones as large as eggs, killing soldiers and horses, lightning strikes setting tents on fire, and winds so strong they collapsed entire sections of the camp. While the date suggests spring rather than winter, the conditions were winter-like, and the storm's impact demonstrated how vulnerable even large, well-organized armies remain to extreme weather. The winter of 1944 to 1945, during World War II's Battle of the Bulge, while far beyond the medieval period, offers instructive parallels to medieval winter warfare challenges. American soldiers, despite having access to modern equipment and supply systems, suffered terribly from cold in the Ardennes forest. The experiences of these modern soldiers, cold injuries, equipment failures, psychological stress, morale problems, paralleled in many ways what medieval soldiers had endured centuries earlier. The fundamental challenge of maintaining an army in winter conditions remained constant across centuries, even as technology and organizational sophistication improved. These historical examples remind us that the techniques and strategies we've discussed were not merely theoretical, but were actively employed by real armies facing real dangers. The soldiers who developed and transmitted this practical knowledge were learning through a process of trial and error that often meant the difference between life and death. Those who failed to learn, or whose commanders failed to apply lessons from previous campaigns, often paid with their lives. As we draw toward the end of our exploration, it's worth reflecting on what this tells us about human adaptability and resilience. The soldiers who endured these conditions were not superhuman. They were ordinary men, pressed into service by feudal obligations or economic necessity, who found within themselves the strength to survive circumstances that would seem unbearable to most modern people. They did so through a combination of practical knowledge, mutual support, discipline, and sheer determination to see another spring. The techniques they developed, from tent construction to clothing layering to food preparation to psychological coping mechanisms, represent accumulated wisdom refined through centuries of experience. While we can critique their understanding of medicine or sanitation from our modern perspective, we must also acknowledge that they achieved survival outcomes that are impressive by any measure. Medieval armies did regularly conduct winter campaigns, did maintain themselves in the field under extreme cold, and did preserve enough combat effectiveness to carry out military operations, all without the benefits of modern technology, medicine, or supply chains. There is something profoundly human in the image of soldiers huddled together in a tent, sharing body heat and meagre rations, maintaining their equipment by firelight, telling stories to pass the long winter nights. These scenes, played out across centuries and continents, remind us that the fundamental challenges of human survival, the need for warmth, food, shelter, companionship, and meaning, remain constant even as the specific circumstances change. The medieval soldier struggling to keep his fire burning on a frozen night in a crusader camp is connected across time to the modern person dealing with their own forms of hardship and uncertainty. The skills and knowledge that allowed medieval soldiers to survive winter conditions were not written down in comprehensive manuals or taught in formal schools for most of the medieval period. They were passed from veteran to recruit, learned through observation and painful experience, transmitted through the collective memory of military units and communities. This oral tradition was remarkably effective at preserving and refining practical knowledge, even if it lacked the systematic organization we associate with modern military training. Each generation of soldiers built upon the accumulated wisdom of their predecessors, modifying techniques to adapt to new circumstances, gradually improving survival outcomes through incremental innovation. By the later medieval period, some of this knowledge began to be recorded in written form. Military treatises, while primarily focused on tactics and strategy, occasionally included practical information about camp management and soldier welfare. The Catalan military writer Ramon Llull, writing in the 13th century, included advice about selecting healthy camp locations and ensuring adequate supplies. Christine de Pizan's Book of Deeds of Arms and of Chivalry, written in the early 15th century, addressed questions of military organization, including provisioning and camp discipline. These written sources provide glimpses into the practical knowledge that soldiers had been using for centuries, now beginning to be systematized and recorded. The social dimension of winter survival deserves final emphasis. While individual knowledge and skill mattered, survival was fundamentally a collective achievement. The soldier who kept watch while his tentmates slept, ensuring the fire stayed lit and no one froze, was performing a service that might save lives. The companion who shared extra food with a sick friend, or took on additional duties when someone was too weak to perform them, was engaging in mutual aid that strengthened the entire unit. The commanders who planned carefully, secured adequate supplies, and looked after their men's welfare were exercising leadership that multiplied the survival chances of hundreds or thousands of individuals. This interdependence created bonds of loyalty and affection that transcended normal social boundaries. Soldiers from different social classes, different regions, even different cultures, found common cause in their shared struggle against winter's hostility. The nobleman and the peasant conscript thrown together in the same campaign might develop respect and even friendship born of mutual dependence. These relationships, forged in hardship, often proved more durable than connections based on peacetime social proximity. The psychological transformation that winter campaigns created in soldiers deserves consideration. Men who survived multiple winter campaigns developed confidence in their ability to endure hardship, a sense of having been tested and proven themselves that shaped their identity for the rest of their lives. Veterans of winter warfare occupied a special status in medieval society, their survival testimony to qualities that were admired: toughness, loyalty, competence, courage. This status could translate into social and economic opportunities after military service ended, with proven soldiers being sought after as retainers, guards, or trainers of other soldiers. Yet the same experiences that created pride and confidence also left scars. The chronic cold exposure, poor nutrition, and disease exposure of winter campaigns left many soldiers with lasting health problems. Frostbite damage to fingers and toes might never fully heal, leaving men with reduced dexterity or chronic pain that affected their ability to work. Respiratory infections sustained during winter campaigns could progress to chronic conditions that shortened lifespans. The psychological toll of witnessing death and suffering, combined with the stress of prolonged hardship, affected mental health in ways that medieval society lacked language to describe, but nonetheless recognized in veterans who seemed changed by their experiences. The role of hope in winter survival cannot be overstated. Soldiers needed to believe that their suffering had purpose, that they would survive to see spring, that their sacrifices meant something. This hope was sustained by various means: religious faith in divine providence and reward in the afterlife, loyalty to lords or causes that made military service meaningful, anticipation of eventual return home, and the basic human capacity to imagine better circumstances even in the midst of present suffering. Without hope, even the best shelter, warmest clothing, and most adequate rations might not suffice to keep soldiers alive through months of winter hardship. Religious faith played a particularly important role in maintaining hope during winter campaigns. Medieval Christianity provided a framework for understanding suffering as meaningful, as a test of faith, or as penance for sin, or as an opportunity to demonstrate virtue. Soldiers could interpret their hardships through this religious lens, finding purpose in suffering that might otherwise seem pointless. The promise of heavenly reward for those who died in service to Christian causes provided comfort to soldiers facing the real possibility of death from cold, disease, or combat, and the regular rhythm of religious observance, daily prayers, weekly mass when circumstances permitted, holy day celebrations provided structure and meaning to days that might otherwise blur together into an undifferentiated nightmare of cold and discomfort. The celebration of religious festivals during winter campaigns deserves particular mention. Christmas, occurring in the depths of winter, was observed even in the most difficult circumstances. Armies might declare a truce to allow soldiers to attend Mass and celebrate the Holy Day. Extra rations might be distributed, creating a feast by military standards even if it would seem modest to civilian eyes. Commanders might organize entertainments, perhaps inviting musicians or performers from nearby towns, or encouraging soldiers to perform for their fellows. These celebrations provided psychological relief, a break in the routine of hardship that allowed soldiers to remember there was more to life than mere survival. The winter solstice, while not a Christian holy day, marked a significant turning point for soldiers enduring winter campaigns. After the solstice, days began lengthening again, however imperceptibly at first, and this represented hope that winter would eventually end, and spring would bring renewed campaigning or return home. Soldiers might mark the solstice with their own informal celebrations, taking comfort in the knowledge that the worst was theoretically behind them, even if weeks or months of cold remained. As modern people, comfortable in heated homes, wearing synthetic insulated clothing, With access to abundant food and modern medicine, it can be difficult to fully appreciate what medieval soldiers endured. The gap between our lived experience and theirs is vast, separated not just by centuries but by fundamental differences in daily existence. We can shower in hot water anytime we wish. They might go months without bathing in more than a token fashion. We adjust our home temperature with a thermostat. They risked carbon monoxide poisoning trying to heat their tents with braziers. We have access to fresh fruits and vegetables year-round. They survived on bread, beans, and salt pork for months. We can communicate instantly with people around the world. They might go weeks without news from home. Yet the human emotions, the fear and courage, the suffering and endurance, the loneliness and companionship, these remain comprehensible across time. We can imagine, however imperfectly, what it felt like to lie in a tent on a winter night, listening to wind tear at canvas, feeling cold seep through layers of wool, wondering if morning would bring relief or just another day of hardship. We can understand the bonds formed between men who depended on each other for survival, even if our own friendships are forged in less extreme circumstances. We can appreciate the combination of practical knowledge and stubborn determination that allowed survival, even if we've never had to apply such knowledge ourselves. The story of how medieval soldiers survived freezing nights in their tents is ultimately a story about human adaptability and communal resilience. It reminds us that people are capable of enduring extraordinary hardships when necessity demands, that practical knowledge accumulated through experience can solve problems that seem insurmountable, and that mutual support and cooperation are often the difference between survival and catastrophe. These lessons remain relevant in our own time, even though the specific circumstances have changed dramatically. Winter has always been humanity's testing ground, the season that separates those who planned and prepared from those who didn't, those who worked together from those who insisted on going it alone, those who maintained hope from those who surrendered to despair. Medieval soldiers who survived winter campaigns passed these tests, not through superior strength or intelligence, but through practical knowledge, mutual support, and stubborn determination to survive until spring. As we close this exploration, imagine one final scene. Dawn breaking over a medieval military camp on a winter morning. The sky lightens from black to grey, revealing rows of snow-dusted tents, thin streams of smoke rising from campfires that have burned through the night. From the tents emerge soldiers, stiff from cold and cramped sleeping, their breath visible in the frigid air. They stamp their feet and beat their arms against their sides, trying to restore circulation. Someone makes a joke, and laughter rings out, momentarily pushing back the cold and darkness. Fires are stoked back to life. Water is set to boil. The day's work begins. These soldiers survived another night. They will face this day and the next and all the days until winter releases its grip, because that is what soldiers have always done: endure, adapt, and somehow find the strength to face whatever comes. The techniques and knowledge we've explored tonight, the practical details of tents and clothing, fires and food, represent the accumulated wisdom of countless soldiers across centuries. But perhaps the most important lesson is simpler and more profound: that humans, when faced with seemingly impossible challenges, often find ways to not just survive, but to maintain their humanity, their compassion for one another, their capacity to find meaning and even joy in the midst of hardship. The medieval soldiers shivering in their tents on frozen winter nights, sharing body heat and thin rations, keeping watch over sleeping companions, maintaining their equipment by firelight, were engaged in an act of collective survival that honored the best of human nature. As you drift towards sleep tonight, wherever you are, in whatever warmth and comfort surrounds you, spare a thought for those long-ago soldiers and all the other people throughout history who faced winter's challenge with courage and endurance. Their struggles and their survival are part of the great human story, a story of which we are all a part, connected across time by the shared experience of being human, of facing difficulty, of finding within ourselves the strength to endure. May your own night be warm and peaceful, your sleep undisturbed by cold or fear, your dreams pleasant as you rest secure in the knowledge that others before us faced far greater challenges and somehow, through knowledge and courage and mutual care, found ways to survive and even to thrive. The fires still burn in imagination across the centuries, small lights of human warmth and determination against the vast cold darkness of winter nights, long past but never forgotten. Good night, and may you wake refreshed to a new day, carrying with you the knowledge that human beings are more resilient, more